The galaxy was an expanse of stars, each system a flickering signal in the immense void. At the farthest reaches of this cosmos lay Afra, a jungle-covered planet discovered only months prior. Its towering forests, glowing rivers, and vibrant array of life forms made it a scientific wonder. However, the Galactic Peacekeeping Force, GPF, was more interested in the minerals concealed beneath its surface than its beauty. Darren Cole stood in the EEG's hangar bay, adjusting the straps on his armored vest. His helmet rested beside him on a crate, its visor scratched from years of use. Around him, the other members of his squad were performing final equipment checks, their voices a low murmur against the hum of the ship's engines. "Renly," Captain Ardan said during the pre-landing briefing, her voice echoing through the comms. "It's what we're here for. Scans indicate the mineral is present in veins across Afra's surface. Initial analysis suggests it could transform our energy systems. We extract a sample, evaluate its viability, and report back. Standard reconnaissance operation." Darren was not entirely convinced. Recon missions rarely remain straightforward, especially on planets as remote as this one. He glanced around at his squad, their faces illuminated by the harsh overhead lights. Corporal Hartley, the team's heavy weapons specialist, cracked a joke with Yannick, the squad medic. Lieutenant Pierce, their no-nonsense second-in-command, was double-checking the drone deployment protocols. "Are you good, Cole?" Pierce asked, her sharp gaze cutting through Darren's thoughts. "Yeah," Darren replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "Just eager to get this over with." The EEG roared as it pierced Afra's atmosphere, its hull glowing faintly from the friction of entry. Through the ship's viewport, Darren caught his first glimpse of the planet's surface. An unbroken expanse of emerald and gold. The jungle's canopy rippled like waves in the wind, while mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks crowned with mist and flashes of bioluminescent light flickering among the trees. "Approaching landing zone," the pilot announced, her voice calm yet focused. The ship's engines hummed as they adjusted for a controlled descent. Darren tightened the straps on his harness, the vibrations of the ship's movements rattling his bones. Beside him, Hartley nudged his shoulder. "Not bad for a death world, huh?" Hartley grinned. "I've seen worse." "You always say that," Darren muttered, his gaze fixed on the viewport. Hartley chuckled, unfazed. "Well, it's true. Remember Atrix? That ice storm nearly turned us into popsicles. This is paradise by comparison." The ship touched down with a gentle thud, the landing strut sinking slightly into the soft, mossy ground. The ramp lowered with a hiss, releasing a rush of humid air that carried the rich scents of earth flowers and something faintly metallic. "Welcome to Afra," Captain Ardan said as the squad unbuckled and gathered their gear. "Let's make this quick and efficient. Drones first. Then we split into teams to cover more ground. Stay sharp and no heroics." Darren slung his rifle over his shoulder and followed the others down the ramp. The first thing that struck him was the scale of the jungle. The trees towered above them, their trunks as wide as shuttle bays, their canopies so dense they blocked out much of the sunlight. Vines hung like curtains, and vibrant flowers of every hue dotted the undergrowth. Strange bird-like calls echoed in the distance, mingling with the faint rustle of leaves. "Holy moly," Janik whispered, scanning the surroundings. "This place is alive." "Keep your awe in check, Doc," Pierce said. "We have work to do." Ardan deployed the drones, their sleek metallic forms zipping into the air and spreading out to scan the area. Data streamed onto the squad's handheld displays, highlighting soil composition, plant structures, and the faint signatures of renally deposits. "Concentrations are higher to the west," Pierce reported, studying her screen. "We'll need to split up to cover the area efficiently." "Team assignments," Ardan began, her voice clipped. "Pierce, take Hartley and Janik north. Cole, you're with Lyle. Head west along the riverbank. We regroup here in 6 hours. Stay sharp and don't wander off the grid." Darren and Private Lyle moved cautiously through the jungle, their boots sinking slightly into the spongy moss that carpeted the ground. The air was thick and heavy, beads of sweat already forming on Darren's brow. His rifle was raised, its barrel cutting through the dense foliage ahead of them. "Feels like we're the first people to ever step foot here," Lyle said, his voice low. "Maybe we are," Darren replied, though his grip on his rifle tightened. The river came into view, its waters shimmering with an unnatural iridescence. Strange, translucent fish darted beneath the surface, their scales glowing faintly. The sound of the water rushing over smooth rocks was almost soothing, a stark contrast to the uneasy silence of the jungle. Lyle crouched by the riverbank, deploying a drone to take soil samples. "High renally content here," he said, checking his display. "Looks like we're on the right track." Quote, dot. Darren scanned the tree line, his instincts prickling. "Keep your eyes open," he said. "Something about this place feels off." Quote, dot. Lyle chuckled nervously. "Come on, Cole." Quote, dot. "Arden said the life forms here weren't hostile." "That doesn't mean they're not dangerous," Darren muttered, as if on cue. A low growl rumbled through the jungle. Darren froze, his finger tightening on the trigger of his rifle. "What was that?" Lyle whispered, his eyes wide. The growl came again, closer this time. Darren turned, his heart hammering in his chest. From the shadows, a figure emerged, sleek, predatory, and unlike anything he'd ever seen. The creature resembled a panther, but its body was covered in shimmering, scale-like fur that reflected the light in a rainbow of colors. Its eyes glowed green, and its claws were as long as daggers. It crouched low, its muscles coiling like springs. "Contact!" Darren shouted, raising his rifle. The panther lunged, the creature moving with blinding speed, its claws slashing through the air. Darren fired a plasma bolt, striking its flank. But the wounds closed almost instantly, the shimmering scales knitting back together as if they had never been touched. Lyle screamed, his shots going wide as the panther barreled into him. Its claws tore through his armor like paper, and with a sickening crunch it bit into his neck. Blood sprayed across the moss, and Lyle's scream was abruptly silenced. "Lyle!" Darren roared, firing again. The plasma rounds hit their mark, but the panther barely flinched. It turned toward him, its glowing eyes narrowing. Darren's mind raced. He was outmatched. He turned and ran, his boots pounding against the ground as the panther gave chase. The undergrowth whipped at his face, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He tripped. The panther pounced, its claws outstretched. Darren raised his arms in a futile attempt to shield himself, bracing for the inevitable. The creature froze mid-leap, an arrow streaking through the air, its shaft embedding itself in the panther's skull. The beast collapsed, its lifeless body crashing to the ground inches from Darren. Darren stared, his chest heaving. Slowly, he turned his head toward the direction of the arrow. From the shadows, a group of figures emerged. They were small, no taller than 4 feet, but their presence was commanding. Their skin shimmered a deep blue, and their golden eyes glowed with an intensity that sent a shiver down Darren's spine. Each carried a bow, their quivers brimming with arrows tipped with faintly glowing crystals. One of them stepped forward, her movements fluid and graceful. Her long, dark hair was braided with vines, and her gaze was sharp and calculating. "You need to move," she said, her voice melodic but firm. "The others will be here soon." Quote, dot. "Others?" Darren managed to say, his voice shaking. The jungle trembled as a chorus of growls filled the air. "Run!" the woman said. Darren didn't need to be told twice. He pushed himself to his feet, his heart pounding as the growls grew louder. The jungle trembled with the movement of unseen predators, and the shadows seemed to shift with malice. "Follow me!" the blue-skinned woman commanded, her voice calm despite the chaos. Her golden eyes flicked toward him as she raised her bow, another arrow already knocked. The rest of the alien women fanned out, their movements fluid and synchronized. Their bows were a blur as they fired into the undergrowth, the arrows striking with lethal precision. Each shot lit up the jungle with a faint glow, and Darren glimpsed other panthers falling, their bodies crumpling under the strange glowing arrows. "Move!" the woman barked, snapping him out of his trance. Darren followed her, stumbling over roots and ducking beneath hanging vines. The alien women guided him through the maze of the jungle, their smaller forms darting effortlessly between the massive trees. Darren struggled to keep up, his legs burning with exertion, but the woman stayed close, glancing back to ensure he was still with her. The growls were everywhere now, echoing from all directions. "They're circling us!" he shouted, gripping his rifle tightly. "Not for long," the woman replied, her voice calm. The group reached a clearing where the jungle floor sloped upward, leading to a towering tree with an enormous hollow at its base. The alien women darted inside, motioning for Darren to follow. Once inside, The world fell silent. The walls of the hollow were lined with glowing crystals, casting a soft blue light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with Darren's racing heart. The woman who had spoken to him earlier turned, her bow lowered, but her expression stern. "You're safe here, for now." Quote, dot. Darren sank to the ground, his chest heaving, his brow. He wiped the sweat from his brow, his eyes flicking between the women. Their blue skin shimmered in the dim light, their forms both alien and strikingly beautiful. "Who are you?" he managed to ask, his voice hoarse. The woman hesitated before answering. "We are the Scythe," she said, "protectors of this jungle, and you, outsider, should not be here." Darren opened his mouth to respond, but another voice interrupted. "Raylan, who is this?" Quote. A second Scythe woman stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. She was shorter than the others, her features sharper, but her expression held the same air of command. "He's a human," Raylan replied, her gaze never leaving Darren, "and he's alive because of us." Quote, dot. Darren raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," he said quickly. "My team and we were sent to survey the planet. We didn't know anyone lived here." Quote, dot. Radian's eyes narrowed. "And yet your presence threatens everything." "What do you mean?" Darren asked. "The material you seek, the Renali, lies beneath our village," Raylan said. "It is sacred to us. It is life. If you take it, the jungle will die, and so will we." Raylan and the others escorted Darren through a hidden path that wound up one of the massive trees. The climb was grueling, but the view that greeted him at the top stole his breath. The Scythe village was a marvel of engineering and nature. Circular wooden platforms were built around the trunks of the giant trees, connected by rope bridges that swayed gently in the breeze. Glowing crystals hung from the branches like lanterns, bathing the village in a soft, ethereal light. Scythe of all ages moved between the platforms, their movements graceful and purposeful. "This is incredible," Darren said, his voice filled with awe. "His home. It is home," Raylan replied simply. As they walked through the village, Darren noticed how seamlessly it blended with the jungle. Every structure was built using materials from the forest, and not a single tree had been cut down. The Scythe lived in harmony with their environment, a stark contrast to the industrialized worlds Darren was used to. Raylan led him to a small hut built around the base of a tree. Inside, the walls were adorned with woven tapestries depicting scenes of the jungle, and a glowing crystal sat in the center, illuminating the space. "Rest," she said, gesturing to a low platform covered in soft furs. "You'll need your strength." Darren hesitated. "Raylan, I don't understand. If the Renali is so important, why haven't you tried to stop us from coming here?" Her golden eyes met his, a flicker of sadness in their depths. "We've tried many times, but your kind doesn't listen." Quote, dot. Darren frowned, guilt gnawing at him. "I'll listen," he said. "I'll do whatever I can to help." Quote, dot. Raylan studied him for a long moment before giving a small nod. "We'll see." Quote, dot. Over the next several days, Darren remained in the village, learning about the Scythe and their way of life. They showed him how they cultivated the jungle's resources, using the Renali not only for energy but also for healing and protection. He watched as they wove the glowing crystals into their weapons and tools, their reverence for the mineral evident in every movement. Raylan spent much of her time with him, guiding him through the village and the surrounding jungle. Despite her initial wariness, she began to open up, sharing stories of her people's history and their unbreakable bond with the forest. For Darren, every moment with her felt like a revelation. She was unlike anyone he had ever met. Strong, intelligent, and deeply connected to the world around her. One evening, as they sat on a platform overlooking the jungle, Darren turned to her. "I've spent my whole life following orders," he said. "But being here with you, it's made me question everything." Quote, dot. Raylan's expression softened. "And what do you see now?" Quote, "I see something worth fighting for," he said quietly. Raylan hesitated, then reached out, her fingers brushing against his hand. "Then fight for it, Darren," she said. "Fight for us." Quote, dot. The jungle was quiet as the evening settled over the Scythe village. The soft hum of the glowing crystals blended with the faint rustle of leaves. Darren and Raylan sat together on a platform, overlooking the canopy, the vast expanse of green stretching out into the horizon. Above, the stars shone brightly, their light casting a soft glow over the two figures. Darren leaned back, resting his weight on his palms, his gaze fixed on the sky. "It's strange," he said after a long silence. "I've seen so many worlds, so many stars, but here, for the first time, it feels different, like I actually belong." Raylan glanced at him, her golden eyes thoughtful. "You're not like the others who came before you," she said softly. "They saw only what they could take. But you see what's here." Darren turned to her, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You're why I see it," he said. "You've shown me what this place means. What it means to you, to your people, and to me." Raylan's expression shifted, her usual guarded demeanor giving way to something more vulnerable. "I didn't expect to feel this way about you," she admitted. "You're so different, but in the best way." Darren felt his heart race at her words. He reached out hesitantly, his fingers brushing the edges of her face. She didn't pull away. Instead, she shifted closer, her eyes searching his. For a moment they simply looked at each other, the space between them charged with unspoken emotion. "I don't want to leave," Darren said quietly. "Not without you." "You can't stay," Raylan whispered, her voice trembling. "Why not?" he asked, his voice steady. "Raylan, He paused, the words catching in his throat before finally spilling out. "I love you." Her breath hitched, her eyes widening. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, she leaned forward, her lips brushing against his in a tentative kiss. Darren froze for a moment, then responded, cupping her face in his hands as the kiss deepened. The world around them seemed to fade. The hum of the jungle, and the glow of the crystals, a distant backdrop to the fire between them. Raylan's hands rested against his chest, her touch light but firm, her fingers tracing the edges of his armor. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. Raylan pressed her forehead to his, her voice a whisper. "I love you too." Darren smiled, his heart pounding. "Then what's stopping us?" Raylan pulled back, her expression conflicted. "You don't understand," she said. "You're larger than life to me. You'll break me." Darren chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You're perfect," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "More than perfect." She hesitated, her cheeks flushing a deeper shade of blue. "I don't know if this can work," she said, "but I want it to." "Then we'll make it work," Darren said firmly. He leaned in again, capturing her lips in another kiss, this one filled with unspoken promises. His hands rested gently on her waist, his touch careful, as if afraid to break the moment. The stars above bore silent witness as the two of them shared their vulnerability and love, their connection deepening with each passing second. The stars hung like scattered diamonds in the sky, their faint light shimmering over the jungle canopy. On the platform outside Raylan's home, the air was filled with the soft hum of the crystals and the faint rustle of the leaves. The village had grown quiet, and the only sounds were the distant calls of alien creatures and the rhythmic thrum of their hearts. Raylan sat beside Darren, her knees drawn to her chest, her golden eyes glowing softly in the dim light. She looked at him, her expression thoughtful but hesitant. "You're quiet tonight," Darren said gently, turning to face her. "There's much to think about," she replied, her voice soft, almost unsure. A rare thing for someone so confident and strong. Darren reached out, brushing a strand of her dark hair from her face. "I can see it in your eyes," he said. "You're holding something back." She looked down, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her woven garment. "It's complicated," she admitted. "You make me feel things I didn't know I could feel. Things I never thought I'd want." He smiled, his voice tender. "You don't have to hide that from me." Her gaze met his, and for a moment, all the tension in the world seemed to dissolve. Slowly, She leaned closer, her lips brushing against his. The kiss was hesitant at first, but as Darren responded, it deepened, their emotions spilling into each other. His hands found her waist, holding her gently, as if she might slip away. When they broke apart, both were breathing heavily. Raylan, I've never... With anyone? She pulled back slightly, looking into her eyes. We don't have to do anything you're not ready for, he said. I just want to be with you. ... She hesitated, her cheeks flushing a deeper shade of blue. You're from me, she said, her voice trembling. You're so much. I'm afraid you'll hurt me. ... Darren chuckled softly, his hand moving to cup her cheek. You're perfect, he said, his tone filled with sincerity. I'll never hurt you, I promise. ... Raylan smiled faintly, her golden eyes glimmering with trust. She leaned into his touch, her own hand tracing the lines of his face. You're the first person I've ever let in, she confessed. But I don't know if I can. ... Darren nodded, understanding her hesitation. We'll go as far as you want, he said. Nothing more. ... She kissed him again, her hands sliding over his chest as the connection between them grew. Darren's fingers grazed the edges of her garment, his movements slow and deliberate, waiting for her to guide him. Her hands were now unzipping his pants. She adjusted her position, rolling on top of him. Put it in slowly, she said with a smirk. Once it was in, she let out a soft moan. It's in my stomach, Darren said, gripping his shirt. You ready? Darren asked, preparing to thrust. Raylan nodded. Stretch me. ... The moment. The moment was the best Darren had ever felt, each thrust giving him the best sensation he had ever felt. The morning sun filtered through the canopy, casting golden streaks across the village. The jungle was alive with its usual symphony of sounds. Chirping birds, the rustle of leaves, and the distant hum of the glowing crystals that seemed to pulse faintly in rhythm with the forest's energy. Darren stirred, blinking against the soft light. The events of the night before came rushing back to him. Their kiss, Raylan's vulnerability, and the unspoken promise they had shared. He glanced to his side and saw her sitting by the window of her hut, gazing out at the jungle. Her hair, dark and smooth, caught the light, and her expression was serene, though her fingers toyed with the edge of her garment as if lost in thought. Good morning, he said softly. She turned her golden eyes meeting his. A small smile curved her lips. You slept well. For the first time in a long while, he admitted, sitting up. You didn't sleep? She shook her head, her smile fading slightly. There's too much on my mind. ... To Tumut. Darren stood, crossing the room to sit beside her. Talk to me, he said, his voice steady. Whatever it is, we'll face it together. ... Raylan looked at him, her expression torn. You've seen how my people live, she began. Our bond with the jungle, with the Rainali. It's everything to us. But your people, she hesitated. They won't stop until they've taken it all. ... I won't let that happen, Darren said firmly. Here. He reached for her hand, holding it gently. I don't know how yet, but I'll find a way to stop them. You're only one man, she said softly, though there was no doubt in her voice, only sadness. And they are many. ... One man who believes in something is more dangerous than an army that doesn't, Darren replied, his green eyes meeting her golden ones. And I have something worth fighting for now. ... Raylan's gaze softened, her fingers tightening around his. And I have something worth believing in. ... Later that morning, Raylan led Darren deeper into the jungle. They moved in silence, the only sounds the crunch of leaves beneath their feet and the distant calls of unseen creatures. The path they followed was narrow and winding, hidden beneath thick vines and tangled roots. Where are we going? Darren asked as they pushed through a curtain of hanging moss. You need to see it, Raylan replied, to understand why we fight so hard to protect this place. ... The path opened into a clearing where a massive tree stood at the center. Its roots spiraled downward into a wide cavern glowing faintly with the light of countless Rainali crystals embedded in the walls. The air inside was cool and tinged with a faint metallic tang. "This is the heart of the jungle," Raylan said, her voice reverent. She gestured to the crystals. "The Renali doesn't just exist here. It sustains us. It flows through the roots of the trees, the rivers, even the creatures. Without it, this jungle would wither, and so would we." Quote, dot. Darren approached the nearest crystal, his hand brushing against its surface. It was warm to the touch, almost alive. A faint hum resonated through his fingertips as though the crystal were vibrating with energy. "It's incredible," he said, a color in his voice. "I've never seen anything like this." Quote, dot. Raylan stepped beside him, her gaze fixed on the glowing walls. "Your people see it as a resource to exploit," she said quietly. "But to us, it is sacred. Taking it would destroy everything we are." Quote, dot. Darren turned to her, his expression serious. "I'll make them understand," he said. "Somehow, I'll make them see what's at stake." Quote, dot. Raylan's golden eyes glimmered with hope. "You truly believe you can stop them?" Quote, "I have to," he replied. "For you, for this place." Quote, dot. The peace of the moment shattered as the distant sound of explosions echoed through the jungle. The ground trembled beneath their feet and the glow of the crystals flickered, as if in response. "They found us," Raylan said, her voice tight with fear. Darren's heart sank. He grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the cavern's entrance. "We have to warn the village!" As they emerged into the sunlight, the sounds of gunfire and shouting grew louder. Smoke rose in thick plumes above the treetops, and the once serene jungle was alive with chaos. Darren's stomach twisted as he realized what was happening. The GPF had launched an assault. Darren and Raylan sprinted toward the village, their path illuminated by the fiery glow of burning trees. When they arrived, the scene was devastating. The Zayth warriors fought desperately, their glowing arrows piercing through the smoke as they defended their home. GPF soldiers advanced in tight formations, their rifles spitting plasma rounds that tore through the wooden structures. Darren raised his own rifle, firing at the soldiers. His shots were precise, aimed to disable rather than kill. "We have to stop this," he shouted to Raylan. "Go to them," she urged, her voice breaking. "Talk to your people. Make them stop." Darren nodded, his heart heavy. He pushed through the chaos, dodging plasma fire as he made his way toward the GPF's command unit. When he reached Captain Ardan, she turned to him, her expression a mix of shock and fury. "Cole!" she barked. "What the hell are you doing?" "Calling this off!" he shouted. "You can't do this, Captain. You're destroying an entire species." "They're in the way of the mission," Ardan replied coldly. "Stand down, Specialist, or I'll have you court-martialed." Quote, dot. "Then court-martial me," Darren said, stepping in front of her rifle. "But you'll have to shoot me first." Quote, dot. Ardan's hesitation lasted only a moment before she motioned for her squad to advance. The battle raged on, and Darren's world dissolved into chaos. The battle in the Zayth village raged with ferocity, smoke billowing into the jungle's canopy as plasma bolts and glowing arrows streaked through the air. The Zayth fought valiantly, their movements synchronized and precise, but the GPF's superior firepower slowly pushed them back. Darren moved through the chaos, desperately trying to reach Captain Ardan again. He ducked behind a fallen tree as a plasma bolt exploded nearby, the shockwave rattling his bones. His mind raced. How could he stop this? How could he make them see reason? "Raylan!" Her voice called out to him through the din. "Darren!" He turned, and saw her fighting alongside her people, her bow a blur as she loosed arrows into the advancing soldiers. Her golden eyes burned with determination. But he could see the strain on her face. They couldn't hold out much longer. Darren rose to his feet, determination hardening his resolve. If he couldn't convince the GPF to stop, he'd fight for the Zayth with everything he had. As he sprinted toward the front lines, a familiar voice barked out over the chaos. "Cole! Stand down! Kua!" Captain Ardan emerged from the smoke, her rifle raised. Her expression was cold, her jaw tight. Behind her, a squad of soldiers advanced in a tight formation, their weapons aimed at the Zayth warriors. "Don't do this, Ardan!" Darren shouted. "You're not just killing a village, you're killing an entire world." "Enough, Cole," she snapped. These creatures are standing between us and the future of galactic security. If you side with them, you're a traitor. Quote dot. Darren stepped forward, his hands raised. Listen to me. The Renali isn't just a resource. It's alive. It sustains this jungle, these people. If you take it, you'll destroy everything. Arden's eyes narrowed. This isn't your decision to make. She motioned to her soldiers. Take him down. Quote. The soldiers raised their rifles, but before they could fire, a volley of arrows rained down from the trees. The Zayth had taken the high ground, their glowing arrows cutting through the GPF ranks with deadly precision. Darren seized the moment, diving for cover as the battle erupted around him once more. Raylan appeared at his side, her chest heaving as she pulled him to his feet. We need to fall back, she said. I'm not leaving you, Darren replied, his voice firm. As they turned to retreat, a plasma bolt struck the ground near Darren's feet, the explosion sending him flying, pain ripping through his leg as he landed hard on the jungle floor. He gasped, his vision blurring as blood soaked his trousers. Raylan skidded to his side, her hands trembling as she examined the wound. No, 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 she whispered, her voice breaking. Darren tried to sit up, his head spinning. I'm fine, he said through gritted teeth, though he knew it wasn't true. His leg was a mangled ruin, the damage beyond repair. You're not fine, Raylan said, tears streaming down her face. Stay still. The Zayth and the jungle itself rallied against the GPF, their combined efforts forcing the soldiers into a retreat. The massive panther, though wounded, delivered a final blow to the GPF supply line, scattering their forces. Captain our sedan, she shouted orders, but her voice was drowned out by the chaos. Within hours, the battle was over. The GPF survivors fled back to their dropships, leaving the jungle in smoldering ruins. The Zayth stood victorious, but the cost was evident. Raylan and a group of Zayth warriors carried Darren back to the village, his vision fading in and out as they worked to stabilize him, using Renali to stem the bleeding and dull the pain. Despite their efforts, the damage was irreversible. When Darren awoke, he was back in Raylan's hut. The pain in his leg was gone, replaced by a strange numbness. He sat up slowly, his heart sinking as he looked down. His right leg ended just below the knee, the wound wrapped tightly in glowing bandages. Raylan sat beside him, her expression a mix of relief and sorrow. You're alive, she said softly. Darren reached for her hand, his voice trembling. You saved me. You saved us, she replied, her golden eyes glistening with tears. But this wasn't the price I wanted you to pay. Quote dot. In the weeks that followed, Darren adjusted to his new reality. The Zayth crafted a prosthetic for him using rhinopleali and materials from the jungle. It was light, strong, and surprisingly agile, though it took time for him to adapt. As he healed, he became a part of the village. He helped rebuild what had been destroyed, forging deeper bonds with the Zayth and learning their ways. Raylan remained by his side, their love growing stronger with each passing day. One evening, as they stood on a platform overlooking the jungle, Darren spoke the words he had been holding back. I'm not going back, Raylan. My place is here, with you. Quote dot. She looked at him, her golden eyes filled with emotion. Are you sure? Your people won't forgive you for what you've done. Quote dot. I don't care, he said. I have everything I need right here. Quote dot. Raylan smiled, leaning against him as they watched the stars. For the first time in years, Darren felt at peace.